All right, so now that our service is ready, let's go ahead and take care of the view model, which takes care of the communication between the data and the actual view, which is our main activity. And we will also design how our application is going to look like a little later. But for now, let's set up the view model. Okay, now, therefore, let's go ahead and create a new class MainViewModel. Okay, so this will be the view model for our main view, and it will be of type viewModel. All right, viewModel. Okay, it's inside of Android X a lifecycle, and we need to add the brackets here. Okay, now inside of this MainViewModel, let's go ahead and create a data class that will take care of the state of the recipe. So we need to know whether we have the recipes or not, and at which state of basically the recipe downloading we are. Are we loading or are we not loading? Do we have a list or do we not have a list? Do we have an error or do we not have an error? So basically we're going to create the data class for just that, and that will be our recipe state. Okay, so here what we're going to do is we're going to have a, and it will not have curly brackets, it's a data class, right? So we are just going to have a loading boolean, and I'm going to say by default it will be true. Then we will have a list of type category. Okay, so that's what we want to display, the categories. And also let's define this as being an empty list at the start. So we are already giving it the default value of being an empty list. And then let's have an error, which will be a string nullable. So we don't have an error. So at the point where we don't have an error, I'm just going to say null. So the error is null, which means it's empty. And if you want a variable to be null, or you want a variable to be able to be null, you should use the question mark after the data type. So in our case, string question mark, which makes this string a nullable. Okay, so it can be null. It is able to be null, therefore it is nullable. Nullable. Yeah, English language is great. So now that we have the recipe state, let's go ahead and for our main view model, create a global variable that I'm going to call category state, which will be a mutable state of, and it's this one here, our recipe state. So you can see we basically just created our own state. We need to add the brackets here so that it works. And this is basically just an object type or a data class. And we saw that we can use mutable state of with all kinds of data types. So strings, booleans, integers or ints, but also of data classes that we created ourselves. So now let's go ahead and create another variable, categories state, which will be in fact a state of type recipe state. And that will be whatever category state is. Now we need to import state for this to work. Let's import state. Let me actually make sure that we are using the right state here. And it's the Android compose runtime. Where do we have it? Compose runtime. This one, state. So it's this one here. It's really important that you have the right import, otherwise it will not work. So really make sure that you have this exact same import as I have. Otherwise, you might run into errors and they will be super confusing. Like these errors will be very hard to understand. Okay. So basically we are creating this private variable, and then we are creating this public variable that will be exposed to other classes that want to access them. And we see that our category state will be of type state. So a value holder where reads to the value property during the execution of a composable function, the current recompose scope will be subscribed to changes of that value, which basically just means that we want our user interface to be updated whenever we actually change the state of our recipe state object. So once our object is updated, or like the list is updated, we have downloaded the list and we finally have it available, we want to display it on the screen. And in order to display something on the screen, we need to change the state or the state machine, so to speak, needs to read, hey, the state has changed, so I need to reload my UI. And that's what we're setting or preparing here, basically up. Now, we will need a method that fetches the categories. And as I said, our view model takes care of the communication between the data and the UI. So basically it prepares everything so that the UI can work with it, which is why we're going to set up a function which allows us to fetch the categories. So let's go ahead and create a private fun fetch categories. So to fetch something is to get something. So that's just a keyword that is used in coding all the time. And here we're going to use we're going to use something called a view model scope. And a view model scope provides a launch for suspend functions to be processed. So as I said earlier, a suspend function is something that runs in the background. So in the not on the main thread, blocking the main thread. So it's basically really taking care of doing things in the background. And if you want to start a suspend function, you actually have to start it inside of a coroutine, as I said. So in order for this to happen, we can use this thing called view model scope. So view model scope. So inside of our main view model, we will create this view model scope, and this will import view model scope up here. We need to import this lifecycle view model scope, and then we can launch it. So there's this launch method, and then in curly brackets, that's where we can run our code now. So you see this coroutine scope. So here you see this keyword coroutine that I was talking about earlier. So a coroutine is basically allowing you to run a routine in the background and code in the background. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to run my try and catch. So try and catch is what we use if we want to stop our program from crashing if we have an error. So that's what this try and catch does. It sees that something goes wrong, it catches this error, and then it informs us about the problem or the error that appeared. So you need to say what kind of error you're going to take, and I'm just going to call any exception. So there's this exception thing, which is very generic, and it basically is for all exceptions, for all errors that could appear. And then I'm just gonna say what should happen if I get an error. I'm just gonna say the value of our category state will be category state.value.copy, and then here I'm gonna set loading to false, and I'm going to display the error. So error is going to be error fetching categories, and then I can add e.message, and this should be safe saying fetching. So what this will do is it will just say, hey, if there is an error, then display error fetching categories plus the error message. So this E, this exception, contains an error message, and we can put print that out. And we're going to put that into the error so that if we want to display the error, we can do so by just accessing the error of our recipe state. Because this is what this copy does, right? It gets the value of our category state, which is our mutable state of our recipe state. So basically we are overriding and saying, hey, we're not loading anymore. So set loading to false because it failed, and then display the message inside of your error. So this error string will now be filled with the error that we have gotten. So that's what happens once we got an error. And now what should happen, or what do we want to try to happen? Because we're using this try and catch because whenever you want to load data, either from the internet or from your phone, things could go wrong. And that's why you're surrounding it with a try and catch, basically making sure that your program doesn't crash, your app doesn't crash if an error appears. So for example, there is no internet connection, or the website doesn't exist anymore, the URL is incorrect, or anything else that could go wrong needs to be caught. So we're catching it here, but let's try to do the thing first. So we're going to try to get a response like so, where we are using the recipe service dot get categories, and then we're using our category state value to be whatever we get from our response. So here with this response is we're saying call this method here that we call this recipe service and get the categories. So this recipe service is just a variable that we're exposing so that it can be used. This is inside of our API service, and our API service says, okay, there is this function called get categories, and what it will reply with is a get categories response, which contains the category list. Okay. Now we have gotten the categories and we've gotten the response, which now we can copy. So we're just going to say value, get the value of the category state and copy it, but override the list to be response.categories, and the loading, set that to false and set the error to null. So basically we're saying this category state, which is of type recipe state, which contains a list of categories, we're going to give it all of those categories. So the categories are inside of the response. So basically we have one thing that is the response that we get from the internet, and then we have a thing how we handle the response inside of our phone. And in order to handle a response, we use the state to get the list of response items. And the response items we get here from the service. So we use the service, this function. I go over it again because it's really complicated, the flow of what is happening, but there's you need to understand this. Once you got that, then you will be fine going forward. Okay, so we now get the categories and we store them inside of this response variable. And now we can use those to override our category state, which is the thing that updates the user interface about the recipe state, which itself contains details about the categories. And then can go ahead and display those. And to display those, we will need to set that up in the next video. Okay, so we're saying we're not loading anymore to our category state. We don't have an error, and then we can go from there. So this fetch categories is basically now going to be the function that we need to call in order to display anything. In order to get the data and then store the data in our phone, and now the next step would be to display the data from what we stored. So I will fetch the categories on initialization. So the moment my main view model ever is used, I want to fetch the categories. So basically run this coroutine, which calls a suspend function, which is this get categories, which uses the suspend key, and gets the categories from the internet using retrofit. And this recipe service enables us to even use this get categories function, which we use in our main view model at this point. And this then enables us to fill the data to our recipe state object that we then make or put into a mutable state of, which is enabling us to change the UI. So really a lot going on here. And this variable here is just going to expose that state to external classes. For example, our main activity or the composable, which is going to take care of all of the user interface, because we're going to call this composable inside of our main activity later on. Okay, so I will go over the entire flow once we have the entire project done. But for now, let's call it a pause or make a pause and come back with the next video.